Right now I'm going to go over basic brisket prep. The beef brisket is one of the favorite barbecue meats to smoke on the Hasty-Bake. Brisket is not a great cut of meat. It's actually a very poor cut of meat, which is why it has to be slow cooked and why it needs barbecue rub and seasoning on it, because it's nowhere near the flavor of a steak. The brisket that I have today is what they call a packer trimmed, which means that it's basically cut off of the cow, and that's it. There's very little other than the meat packer actually cutting the piece of meat off of the cow. The reason I trim a brisket is because it has a lot of fat on it. Some of the fat is going to be cooked out and rendered from the meat, so that will help add flavor, but some of the fat is very, very hard fat. And the very, very hard fat can take 12 to 14 hours to actually render down. So in order to reduce the cook time on the fat, which I don't eat anyway, I go ahead and remove the hard fat. So I'll start by showing the different fat areas on the brisket, and then we'll remove the hard fat, and then we'll season the brisket, and I'll talk about how to smoke it and how to tell whenever it's actually done. So this is the packer trimmed brisket. This one was approximately about 13 pounds. Typically, whenever I trim fat off of a brisket, I usually reduce the weight by about a pound or two of actual fat. Here on this side is what they call the meat side, obviously because you can see the meat. And this is called the fat side because this is where the fat is at. Now, most of the fat on the fat side is soft fat. If you feel it, it actually feels soft to the touch. Soft fat typically will cook away in 4 to 6 hours. The hard fat, which can be found here at the thickest part of the fat, as well as here on the meat side, won't cook away for about 12 to 14 hours. Since you're not going to be eating this fat, and there's plenty of it on there, I prefer to actually remove it. So here on the meat side, you have a large piece of fat, and then here on the fat side, you also have a good portion of fat. However, the soft fat you want to leave, and the hard fat you want to cut out. And the hard fat feels hard, and the soft fat feels soft. So first of all, I'll start with the piece over here on the meat side. This portion is very hard, and it's pretty thick. So I'm going to take my knife and start cutting into it. There's plenty of meat and plenty of fat. If you get a little extra fat or a little bit of meat in with your cuttings, it'll be okay. So basically, I'm just cutting through the fat, looking for where it intersects with the meat at. Now, it's critical to have a very sharp knife whenever you're doing this. If I cut myself with a knife, it's usually because the knife isn't sharp and I'm trying to force it in the place it doesn't need to be. So make sure you have a very sharp knife. So now I've trimmed off this piece of hard fat, which actually is pretty darn hard. Underneath the piece of hard fat is a vein of fat that actually runs from the meat side all the way through to the fat side. Typically, what I try to do is try to remove some of the vein fat if I can, because that piece of fat is going to run through the middle portion of the brisket, and your slices will result with a piece of fat through the middle of them. So I'll remove a portion of it. Some pieces of brisket don't have a thick portion that runs through them. If it's thin, less than 1/4 of an inch, you can leave it in there because it'll cook away. So I'll start here on this end where I can see the fat vein on both sides and begin to cut into it. Not trying to remove the fat, just trying to see where it's at. Since each cow is different, there's no way to know exactly what you're getting into until you start trimming a brisket. Here you can see there's a little bit of fat left on the underside of here, and there's a good portion of fat right here. So I'm going to attempt to remove some of this hard fat here in the middle. Now you can follow the vein back most of the way into the piece of meat. And where that fat vein actually ends is where the flat brisket begins. This is the brisket flat. A lot of times at the grocery store, they will have already carved out the flat brisket for you. So you can buy a flat brisket. Usually it runs a little bit more expensive because you're paying for a piece of trimmed meat. But you can always cut it off and utilize just this portion, and then utilize what they call the point or the crown as well, which is this other part here. I prefer to leave them both together and cook it as a whole brisket. So now I've pulled it back until it gets to the flat. Now I'm going to remove some of the hard fat here across this side. Actually, underneath it isn't very much fat, but there's a good portion of hard fat out this way that I'm going to go ahead and remove. All right, so from the meat side, I've taken most of the hard fat off. You can see I didn't remove all the fat. I left some behind. That fat is going to cook away and render down and actually add good flavor to the brisket as it's cooking. Now I'm going to go to the fat side. On the fat side, typically here where the flat is at, you have a good amount of fat, but it's all soft, so it's going to cook away and help moisturize the meat as it's actually cooking. However, on the point end, it's very, very thick and very, very hard. So I'm going to have to remove a portion of this fat. Once again, very, very critical to have a super sharp knife if you're going to be doing this. I'll start from the back side and poke all the way through to get an idea of where I am in relation to the fat in the meat. You can see there's a good 3/4 inches of hard fat above that meat. Now I've got a nice thin layer of fat above the crown end. I'm feeling to see if there's any more. There's another little thick piece right here that actually feels hard. I'm going to try to remove a portion of that fat as well. Once again, you're not wanting to remove all of the fat, only the parts that really feel hard to the touch. Now here across the flat end, where it wraps around, is another portion of fat that is really pretty thick. Most of it is soft, so if you're cooking for an extended period of time, you'd probably be fine, but I'm going to remove just a little bit of it right here across the thickest portion. All right, so we took our large packer trim brisket. We trimmed the hard fat from the meat side, cutting down into the vein, see how thick it was, removed a little bit of fat from there. And on the fat side, we removed the thickest part of the fat up near the crown where it still felt very hard, and just a little bit as we tapered down to the flat. If you look at it from the side, you can see there's a nice 1/2 inch layer of fat on top of that. That fat will reduce down and make that brisket taste really, really good. When choosing a packer trim brisket, a good rule of thumb is to take it and see if it will fold in half. If it won't fold in half, it usually means it has big pieces of hard fat in there, so you might look around for another brisket. My favorite marinade for using on barbecue is Italian dressing. Italian dressing has oil, it has vinegar, it has onion, it has garlic, and it has bell pepper. The oil in it's going to help brown the meat as well as keep it nice and moist. The vinegar in it is going to help break down the tendinous fibers, and then the onion, garlic, and bell peppers are just going to add great flavor to the overall seasoning. As far as an amount goes, I'm probably putting a tablespoon or 2 on per side. Some folks will like to marinate overnight. The issue with using Italian dressing or anything else that's going to be a vinegar-based marinade is that the acid will begin to cook the meat. So if you're going to marinate overnight, you might dilute down the Italian dressing, or if you're using a vinegar-based marinade, with some beef broth or maybe some apple juice. Because where it gets white and begins to actually cook the meat, it will result in dry and very, very tough meat.